Welcome to the Hidden Orchard podcast, a radical exploration of spirituality, science, and the Bible from a Jewish perspective. Each week we'll look at a new topic and dive deep into the texts that inspire and enrich our lives. So whether you're a seasoned expert or just curious about a topic, there's something for everyone. So sit back, relax, and we'll get to today's episode in a bit. But first, if you haven't done so, visit thehiddenorchard.com and subscribe. It's free, and you'll receive access to content and weekly emails. There you can also subscribe for a paid membership and get access to everything on the site and be the first to hear about online study opportunities where you can meet and interact with other people on the journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have an idea for a topic, reach out to me at thehiddenorchard.com. Now, let's get to today's episode. When we read the New Testament as a product of first century Jewish, and particularly rabbinic thought, a genre shift occurs, overlaying a different set of literary rules and expectations. One of these shifts is that the rabbinic literature is less concerned with historical accounting and tends to focus on spiritual themes and moral lessons. It's not uncommon for a story to then be retold with a different cast of characters and slightly different details. This happens quite often in rabbinic literature. In this way, a story can be tailored to impart a moral lesson for a later audience, all the while still anchored in the biblical texts. In this way, a good midrash can bring a scriptural passage to life, even a one-liner from Proverbs or the Psalms, and to do so in a memorable way. If the Gospels are indeed drawn from this well of tradition, we should expect similar creative liberties within their pages. We've explored this idea through the Gospel story of the healing of the woman and the young girl, and many others, in fact. And through these, what seemed to be an account of a healing or an interaction, creatively dramatize the final redemption of Israel from the nations, using the metaphors of the rabbis and the words of the prophets in the Tanakh. So in this episode, we'll explore another one, the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. My theory is that this story is a midrash, a tale of redemption based on Ezekiel 16 and 2 Kings. Now the encounter with the woman at the well is only found in the Gospel of John. And this is significant as John's writings tend to be cryptic at times, layering in themes of messianic redemption and a flourish of mystical and rabbinic tradition. Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman contains similar elements to these other stories we've covered, and to the Midrash, many of which we'll explore. But let's first reestablish historically who the Samaritans were, and why this would carry any meaning with John's audience at all. The Samaritans and the Israelites had a complex relationship, to say the least. Samaria was home to people who traced their lineage to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the remnants of the northern kingdom. While they shared common ancestry with Judeans, centuries of theological divergence and rival claims of legitimacy, especially over the proper sanctuary, whether it was Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem, all of these grew into mutual hostility. However, many outside and the contemporary writers of the time found no discernible difference between Jews and Samaritans. In the Talmud, this shared lineage seems to have contributed to the Samaritans holding a somewhat unique halakhic status at times, somewhere between Jews and Gentiles. On the other hand, the Samaritans were a mixed people, due to the Assyrian practice of sifting various nations throughout the empire. And the Assyrians did this to break people groups up, more or less to protect from groups of people regrouping and overthrowing the empire. This will factor into our exploration very shortly. So by the 1st century, Samaria may have contained a number of the remnants of the northern tribes of Israel, who had now become assimilated into the local cultic worship and practices. In short, though, between Israelites and Samaritans, both groups traced their origins to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had a version of the scriptures they called the Torah, and believed they were the true covenant people of the God of Israel. As you can imagine, the rabbis might have had some objections to their points. And another major point of contention between the Samaritans and the Israelites, or the Jewish people, was around the Pharisaic oral Torah. Like the Sadducees, the Samaritans rejected the Pharisees' views and their traditions. The apostolic community, on the other hand, generally upheld the Pharisaic traditions and the tenets, and we saw this and we've explored this in the past, through the concepts of Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the world to come, and many more. Nevertheless, for Jesus, the redemption of Samaria may have been an important prophetic fulfillment of his mission to return the lost sheep of Israel. But there's also more. And in order for my theory to hold any water, we have to establish that the woman in the gospel story indeed represents Samaria on the midrashic level. The Bible and rabbinic literature often refer to the nations and people groups in the feminine. We find a connection in Ezekiel 16:46, where Samaria is called a sister. Ezekiel compares Israel to Samaria as women who have engaged in various illicit sexual behaviors and have generally behaved badly. In other midrashim, such as Eliyahu Rabbah, we also see Samaria referred to as a woman. Now, the scene at the well seems to creatively reflect earlier watering well tropes in the Torah, as in Abraham's servant and Rebekah in Genesis 24, Jacob and Rachel in Genesis 29, and Moses and Zipporah in Exodus 2:15. And there's a lot in common with these, literarily and thematically. But in the rabbinic tradition, water, and by extension wells, serve as a powerful metaphor for Torah knowledge and revelation. Jesus' offer of living water is an even deeper reference to the true knowledge of God and the enlightenment and the taste of the redemption to come. We see this in the Midrash, Song of Songs, Rabbah 1. And it says, "Just as water is the source of life for the world, a garden spring, a well of living waters, so is the Torah a source of life for the world." So it's a very inclusive idea here in the Midrash, connecting this well to Torah knowledge. This would be particularly important for the Samaritans, who, as Jesus says, were lost in a false religious system, not knowing what they worship. Now, the conversation between Jesus and the woman seems to get off to a rough start. Jesus is speaking on a spiritual level, but the woman seems to be stuck at the physical level, not comprehending. This is actually a common tool in John's Gospel. We see this dichotomy when Jesus converses with Nicodemus and others. This disconnect, though at the woman's expense, is somewhat of a hat tip to the readers who are clued into the hidden message in Jesus' words. And so we wait a few verses for the woman to catch up. At one point, Jesus calls for the woman to go get her husband. After the woman admits that she has none, Jesus reminds her specifically of 5 other husbands, and he does mention there's one more, but he doesn't say 6, he says 5. As many are aware, the word for husband in Hebrew, Baal, can also serve as the word for master, and is also a common name for a chief deity of the surrounding nations, named Baal. As to the 5 husbands, I think our clue comes from 2 Kings 17:24, where the text mentions 5 nations that the Assyrians blended into Samaria. Each of these nations has its own false gods, of whom the Samaritans began to worship. The nations are Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. The text even goes on to name the chief false gods, 5 of them, each of them corresponding to these nations. So that's an interesting connection for me, the 5 false gods, the masters, the husbands, if you will, of the woman, Samaria. Now the text of 2 Kings fills in the gap with Ezekiel 16 and begins to spell out the primary problems that the Samaritan people have. And 2 Kings 17:34 says, "They do not worship God properly. They do not follow the laws and practices, the teachings and instructions that God enjoined upon the descendants of Jacob, who was given the name Israel." Number 1, we see the mention of Jacob. That happens in John 4:5-6, and also in verse 12. Not following the laws and practices and teachings and instructions, that appears in verse 22. And Jesus, of course, says salvation is from the Jews in that same section. Now, John's mention of the teachings and practices and instructions, to me, is an endorsement of the rabbinic oral tradition. This is another stunning endorsement for the rabbis from Jesus. As in other places, we can understand this to mean more than simply worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem, but also the teachings, the traditions, the interpretations. As Jesus said, "For they sit on the seat of Moses. Now, incidentally, Jesus missed his chance to embolden the claims of replacement theology that he left Judaism behind. We see the opposite. Instead, in this famous passage, he states, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." And to me, this makes a strong connection back to the problem the Samaritans had in 2 Kings 17. Now, there is certainly more in John's gospel here to unpack, but for the sake of time, we've left that for the future. But if this story is indeed a midrash, built from Ezekiel and 2 Kings, it reflects a distinctly rabbinic method of interpretation and writing in the Gospels. The result is a memorable narrative of hope from a passage we might have otherwise passed over. These were the very storytelling techniques that shaped the worldview in which Jesus and his disciples grew up. And why does it matter for a first century Jewish audience? Well, Ezekiel tells us in Ezekiel 16:53, "I will restore their fortunes, the fortunes of Sodom and her daughters, and the fortunes of Samaria and her daughters, and your fortunes along with theirs." In essence, the redemption of Samaria and the people of Sodom signal the redemption of Israel in the future when all things are restored. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this topic. Remember, you can find more information at thehiddenorchard.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share this podcast with your friends. We don't really engage in marketing, so it's word of mouth and references like that really help spread the word. Also, I want to say thank you to those who subscribe to the site and those who support the Hidden Orchard Project financially. Without you, it wouldn't be possible, so thank you. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.